Have you ever felt so lost that you thought no one could find you? Now imagine being responsible for guiding lives through the darkness, even when you yourself are in the dark. This is not just a story of a lighthouse that lights the way for ships. It is a story of how a simple light saved a life and changed the fate of many others. Stay until the end and discover the secret that transformed a forgotten man into an unexpected hero. Get ready to connect with a story that may change the way you see loneliness and purpose. Ellis Greaves had spent 15 years as the keeper of the Evereach Lighthouse, an imposing structure overlooking the relentless tides of the North Sea. Nestled on a rocky island miles from the nearest village, the lighthouse stood like a solitary sentinel against the stormy abyss. The days were calm, filled with the mechanical rhythm of keeping the light, polishing the lens, checking the oil reserves, and ensuring the lighthouse rotated steadily. The nights, however, were lonelier. The wind howled through the cracks of the old building, and the sea roared incessantly, but no human voice joined the symphony. Ellis did not mind the solitude, or so he told himself. The world, after all, had left him behind long ago. His wife, Margaret, had passed away years before. Friends and family had disappeared like echoes in a cave. The lighthouse had become his world, his light, his only companion. On a foggy night, Ellis climbed the spiral staircase to light the lamp, his boots thudding against the iron steps. As the lighthouse came to life, cutting through the foggy darkness, a thought crossed his mind. Who sees this light? Does it even matter? Mornings at Evereach Lighthouse always began the same way. The monotonous sound of waves crashing against the rocks and the wind whispering through the window cracks. Ellis climbed the spiral stairs with the precision of a ritual, checking the mechanisms that kept the light functioning. "All good, old friend," he murmured to the great lens, as if the lighthouse could hear him. The only response was the metallic sound of machinery echoing through the empty tower. In solitude, even inanimate objects became conversation partners. One afternoon, looking through the small circular window of the engine room, Ellis saw something that made him stop. A small boat was struggling against the distant waves, its hull being relentlessly battered by the current. He furrowed his brow, adjusting the telescope for a clearer view. Who in their right mind would be out at sea in weather like this? He murmured to himself, his heart racing. Though he knew he couldn't do much, the light he maintained was the only thing that could prevent a tragedy. That night, as the wind picked up and the clouds swallowed the moon, Ellis sat by the fireplace, trying not to think about the boat. However, the image wouldn't leave him. Maybe they had already found shelter, he said aloud, as if he wanted to convince himself. The voice of the wind seemed to mock him, whistling through the corners of the room. Finally, he got up and walked to the main room of the lighthouse, turning on the light with more attention than ever. "Come on, girl. Shine like you've never shone before," he said, twisting the controls. As the lighthouse beam cut through the darkness, something in Ellis began to change. He realized that little flame in the middle of the ocean meant more than just a mechanical duty. "You are more important than I admit," he said softly, his eyes fixed on the turbulent sea. With every turn of the light, it felt as if he was also turning inside himself, feeling a small spark of purpose. Even without knowing who was out there, he knew he had to keep illuminating the way, both for others and for himself. On a stormy night, a loud crash woke Ellis. Running to the window, he saw a small fishing boat stranded against the rocks, its mast broken and hull cracked. Panic washed over him as he realized that the light, his light, had guided the boat to safety just before the accident. Grabbing a flashlight and a rope, Ellis faced a storm to reach the boat. Two figures clung desperately to the wreckage, their faces pale with fear. Ellis shouted over the wind, throwing them the rope. After an exhausting effort, he pulled them to shore and took them to the lighthouse. The fishermen, Thomas and Jake, were young brothers from the nearby village. As they dried off and warmed themselves by the fire, they shared stories of the dangers they had faced and expressed their gratitude. For the first time in years, Ellis felt something stir in his chest, a connection. The brothers left the next morning, but not before promising to return with supplies. Days later, they returned, along with stories of how the villagers now spoke of the watchful keeper of Everreach. Ellis breathed heavily as he pulled the rope, his muscles screaming from the effort against the wind and rain. "Hang on," he shouted, his voice nearly swallowed by the storm. When he finally managed to bring the two boys to the safety of the rocks, he reached out to help them climb up. "Are you okay?" he asked, examining their pale, soaked faces. One of the young men, shivering, replied, "We thought it was the end, but we saw the light." "Your light." Inside the lighthouse, the fireplace crackled, warming the air while the smell of salt and rain still lingered. Ellis brought blankets and set a kettle over the fire. "Sit down, have some of this," he said, handing each of them a steaming mug of tea. Thomas, the older of the brothers, looked at Ellis with eyes full of gratitude. "If it weren't for you, we would be at the bottom of the sea right now." Ellis looked away, embarrassed. "I just did what anyone would do," he murmured. But the truth was he couldn't remember the last time he helped someone. His younger brother, Jake, looked around with curiosity, noticing the maps, the telescope, and the nautical instruments that filled the space. "Do you live here alone?" he asked, his voice still hoarse. Ellis nodded, stirring his tea. "For years. The lighthouse is my responsibility." Thomas leaned forward, intrigued. "It must be lonely, right?" Ellis hesitated before answering. "Sometimes. But the lighthouse always has something to say. The wind, the waves, and now you." When morning came, the storm had subsided, and the sea was calm. Ellis walked with the two of them to the water's edge, where a small boat sent by the village was already waiting. Thomas shook his hand firmly. "We'll never forget what you did for us." Jake smiled, his eyes still shining with admiration. "Thank you for keeping the light on." As they departed, Ellis stood on the beach, watching the boat disappear. For the first time in years, he felt that his presence in the lighthouse had meaning. The news spread, and more fishermen began to stop by to thank Ellis. Some brought gifts, freshly caught fish, warm bread, or simply news from the mainland. Although the loneliness of the lighthouse remained, Ellis no longer felt invisible. On the third visit of brothers Thomas and Jake to the lighthouse, they brought something Ellis didn't expect: company. Clara, the young teacher from the village, was delighted to meet the keeper of the light who saved lives. She had heard so many stories about him. Reaching out, Ellis, cautious about his own ability to socialize, shook her hand with a shyness that surprised him. He murmured that he didn't know if he was worthy of stories, but Clara smiled. "You guide lives through the darkness, Mr. Greaves. That is already more than many can say." The following days brought regular visits. Clara would show up with a notebook in hand, ready to jot down Ellis's stories. "So, how was your first night here?" she asked one day while they were having tea in the lighthouse kitchen. Ellis scratched his beard, thinking. It was an overwhelming silence until the wind started to batter against the windows. "I never felt so small." Clara carefully noted the answer, but soon looked at him. "And now, do you still feel small?" Ellis chuckled softly. "Sometimes, but the light makes the emptiness not feel so empty." On a clear sky afternoon, Clara asked to go up to the top of the lighthouse. Ellis guided her up the spiral stairs, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the iron structure. "This is where the magic happens," he said, pointing to the huge prism of the Fresnel lens. Clara looked, amazed, at the equipment that scattered beams of light across the ocean. "This is incredible," she said, turning to Ellis. "But even with all this technology, it's you who brings it to life, isn't it?" He shrugged, a slight smile appearing. I think I'm just a caretaker. The light does the real work. Over time, Clara began to bring not only stories from the village, but also questions that challenged Ellis. Why did you choose to stay here, so far from everything? She asked one night. Ellis was silent for a long moment before responding. I thought the world had forgotten me, and maybe I wanted to forget the world too. Clara, with a gentle look, placed her hand over his. Well, the world hasn't forgotten you, and thanks to you, many people can move forward. That moment planted a seed in Ellis. The idea that his light not only illuminated the sea, but also hearts. Years passed, and the lighthouse became more than a symbol of safety. It was a meeting place. The villagers came to hear his stories, for Ellis's wisdom, and for the light that continued to guide their way. One night, Ellis was on the porch, looking at the horizon. The light was rotating behind him, sweeping over the dark sea. Clara joined him, her hand resting on his shoulder. The stars shone above, and the waves gently lapped below. I never thought this light could save me too, murmured Ellis. You lit the way for all of us, Clara replied. And in doing so, you found your own. The lighthouse, once a symbol of isolation, had become Ellis's bridge to the world. By lighting the way for others, he rediscovered his purpose and the connection he thought he had lost forever. As the years went by, Ellis began to realize that the lighthouse was no longer just his lonely home. It had become a gathering place, a landmark for the village, and surprisingly, for himself as well. One night, as he and Clara watched the sea under the starry sky, she broke the silence. Ellis, do you realize how much you've changed since we first met? He frowned, surprised. Changed? I'm still the same lonely man as always. Clara shook her head, smiling. You've become a light, not just for the boats, but for the people. On a particularly busy day, a group of fishermen brought a young apprentice named Peter, who wanted to learn about how the lighthouse worked. Mr. Greaves, can I help light the lamp tonight? Peter asked, his eyes shining with curiosity. Ellis, used to working alone, hesitated before responding. Well, it's a delicate job, but I think we can try. As he showed the boy how to align the lens and adjust the oil, he felt an unexpected joy in teaching. When the light finally shone, Peter exclaimed, it's like the sky has gained a new eye. One afternoon, Clara arrived with an envelope in her hands. Ellis, I wrote about you for a Maritime Stories magazine. They replied, she said, handing him the letter. Ellis carefully opened it and read silently, his expression shifting from surprise to gratitude. They want to publish my story? He asked, incredulous. Clara nodded, excited. People need to know about what you do here. It's inspiring. He sighed, touching the paper. I never thought anyone would be interested in what happens in this forgotten corner of the world. That night, as the lighthouse light spun endlessly, Ellis and Clara talked about the years they had shared there. You know, Clara began, looking at him, this lighthouse doesn't just guide boats. It has changed lives, including mine. Ellis looked at her with a warm smile. And mine, Clara. When I started here, I thought I was illuminating the void. But now I know the light was also for me. Clara held his hand, and it will continue to be. For everyone who crosses this path, the lighthouse, imposing and lit, witnessed a moment of two lives that found meaning amidst the waves. Years after Ellis's death, the Evereach lighthouse still stood tall, its light as steadfast as the man who once kept it. The villagers often told his story to newcomers, pointing to the lighthouse and saying, that light doesn't just guide ships. It reminds us to take care of each other. Ellis's legacy endured, illuminating the hearts of all who came to know him and his light. Did you enjoy the story of Ellis and the light that transformed lives? Discover how purpose and connection can arise even in the loneliest moments. Leave your comment telling us what you thought. Share with someone who needs inspiration. And don't forget to follow for more exciting stories like this one. Together, let's illuminate each other's paths.